Hello, my treasures. The new Hearthstone Core Set has been revealed. This year is going to be the Year of the Wolf, replacing Year of the Hydra. So with this new rotation, we're going to get some even more classic Hearthstone characters returning into standard rotation, while also seeing a very eyesore of certain choices when it comes to what they brought back for each individual classes. I don't know actually how long this one is going to be, so we're going to go by class. Some cards may or may not be talked about as much as the others, but it'll just be based on my opinions on the general card. So let's begin with the Demon Hunter cards. You might be noticing we don't have any Death Knight cards because Death Knight just came out and they didn't want to change any of those. The three cards that we're going to be losing for Demon Hunter, however, are going to be Corvus, Sightless Watcher, and Chaos Nova. We'll be getting Kane, Sunfury, Immolation Aura, and Illidari Studies as the replacements. All three of these cards are probably a lot more playable than any of the previous three cards. The one downside I would say is we're getting more Outcast support, and we still don't have a big payoff for Outcast Demon Hunter. Corvus was the closest thing we had previously to this big payoff, but she always cost a little bit too much to be easily abused with all the really cheap Outcast cards. Kane can be really good if you're going to be playing a aggro deck, as it allows you to ignore any taunts that your opponent might have, and given the fact that a lot of aggro cards have much higher stat pools than when Kane was first in rotation, this card is probably going to be an auto-include in any aggro Demon Hunter decks. Immolation Aura is just a way better AoE than Chaos Nova. You can use it in combination with Blood Mage Thalius in order to do 4 damage instead of just 2 for 4 mana, which again makes it instantly better than Chaos Nova, and it still does have the Fel tag, even though we are going to be losing Jace, where you can no longer easily abuse additional copies. I do think this is just a well-rounded card. It might actually allow Control Demon Hunter to become a thing. And then Illidari Studies. The Outcast pool is small enough where you should be able to get consistent draw power off of this, so I could see this being played too. Alright, now for the next cards. The next ones will be the Druid ones. Staghelm, Force of Nature, Earth Scales, Mounted Raptor are all rotating out, while we are going to be getting Kiri, Solar Eclipse, Lunar Eclipse, and Witchwood Apple as their replacements. Witchwood Apple is actually quite big, especially if we do see more Treant support in this new set, and I'd be shocked if we didn't at this point, since we do know that each Treant is going to cost 1 instead of 2. Solar Eclipse and Lunar Eclipse are cards that can easily be abusable. Solar Eclipse with any really powerful spell where you're going to try to gain a lot of additional spell damage could be really potent. The first thing that comes to mind is a Moonbeam. If you have enough spell power plus Solar Eclipse, you could in theory OTK your opponent that way. So we might see a return of Miracle Druid. The one thing that I am really disappointed at with this new rotation is Staghelm is rotating out. The entire year he was in rotation, he did not see any good support where you would want to run him. And finally, when we get a set where we get a few good choose one cards, he's going to be gone. We're not even going to be able to use him. And it makes me wonder why they made the choose one card so expensive when we aren't going to have Staghelm anymore, which means you can no longer get both of the choose one copies off of it. We also are seeing the retention of the ramp cards for Druid, which makes a lot of sense since that is a key class identity, I would say, at this point for Druid. So things like Nourish and Wild Growth are going to stick around. And again, with Solar Eclipse or any of these other cards, you could easily abuse it. I don't think Kiri will actually see any play because she didn't see play when she was in rotation. However, if they decided to ever lower her cost by 1, she might be a little bit more playable then. So let's get to the Hunter cards. We're going to be losing Helmmaster, Snake Trap, Dire Frenzy, Cloaked Huntress, and Spring Paw. We're going to be gaining instead Dragonbane, Wandering Monster, Cat Trick, Doggy Biscuit, and a Jeweled Macaw. Oh, something I forgot to mention is Tradable is now a evergreen keyword, so we will be seeing a lot of this in some of the later classes. Overall, some of the cards that we're going to be losing, such as Dire Frenzy, would have been nice to stick around because we do have the Freebird in order to use it in combination with, but I'm going to assume that Blizzard might have other ways to easily abuse Freebird if Hunter is going to be losing their best way to do so. We do still have Selective Breeder in rotation, which is pretty decent. Dragonbane being back is good, especially after Questline Hunter is rotating out, as it should allow you to do a lot of damage really easily. It does also have the mech tag now. I don't remember if it did back then, but that's a pretty decent card either way. And the weird thing here I would want to mention is the 2 secrets they decided to bring back. I know there's going to be a lot of the secret support for Hunter rotating out. It would have been really nice if they decided to just keep Ice Trap instead of giving Cat Trick, but it is what it is, I guess, at this point. I don't think Secret Hunter is going to survive this new rotation, even though it is a deck that I've been really wanting to try to figure out how to make use of. Jolt Macaw is also a really weird choice. It's just a generic good add 1 beast card, and they did buff it up a little bit. I don't know if this will see too much play because Big Beast Hunter only relies on you running a few key beasts right now, and that deck isn't going to be losing too much in this rotation. Now, for the next cards, it's going to be the mage ones. Kalecgos, Flamestrike, Pyromaniac, Ethereal Conjurer, and Cone of Cold are going to be rotating out. And then we are going to be getting Stargazer Luna, Firelands Portal, Fire Cell, Flame Geyser, and Arcane Artificer as the cards that are going to be rotating back in. So Kalecgos is a card that again never really saw any additional support. I was really shocked that we didn't see any Dragon Mage support when we had a bunch of dragons in the March of the Lich King set, as we did have Kalecgos, and a lot of the other cards that were rotated back in with the last rotation ended up getting some support before they were rotated back out. I guess the closest Kalecgos actually got to getting any support is big Spell Mage support, which you could have used in theory with him in combination. However, there were just better cards to use at the time. Flamestrike doesn't really see any play right now anyways. It's just too high of cost of a card to see play outside of getting randomly generated. Pyromaniac also never really saw play because it had a higher cost and you had much better things to do on turn 3. Ethereal was alright card, again, just a little bit too high cost, and I think the closest card out of this entire bunch to ever see any play was Cone of Cold in some weird, wacky Freeze Mage support decks, and that is kind of a shame that we are going to be losing that, but it isn't really that big of a deal in my opinion. The cards that we are going to get as replacements are just going to end up being much better versions of all the previous cards. Luna just acts as a way better draw card. It's a really weird card to consider given the fact that it is basically an outcast card, but only for the right handmost card in your hand, but it is still pretty decent. Firelands Portal is just a really good target removal while giving you additional minion on board. Fire Cell is basically just a better Flame Strike at this point. And finally, Arcane Artificer basically replace Deepwater Evoker as a way to gain a bunch of armor in Mage. So let's begin now with the Paladin cards. The cards that we are going to be losing are Ragnaros the Light Lord, Reckoning, Peacekeeper, Avenge, and Noble Sacrifice. And then the cards that we are going to be gaining are going to be Orthaxion, Muster for Battle, Hammer of Wrath, Hand of It All, and Grim Street Outfitter. So I get what they're trying to go for here. They're probably trying to support Dude Paladin as much as humanly possible now that the questline is going to be rotating out, which is a little bit frustrating, but it's whatever. We also are seeing some direct replacements to cards that we currently do have in rotation. For example, Grim Street Outfitter is basically just a worse Stormwind Banner or Alliance Bannerman. Hand of Adol is just another draw card that doesn't AoE buff your hand, but could be easily abused with some of the other Paladin cards that were revealed so far for Festival of Legends. And then Hammer of Wrath is just nice face damage and might actually make it where I can try my hardest to make a OTK Miracle Paladin deck work again. It's kind of sad to see all the secrets removed from Paladin out of the cards that they decided to, because it probably means we're not going to see any additional secret support for Paladin as a class for this entire rotation. But who knows, they could always replace these secrets later on with much better options, because a lot of these have been power crept out of existence. Ragnaros the Light Lord is also another legendary that just really never saw any real good support. Now for the Priest. Priest is the one that's going to have the biggest changes to it, because they're going to be including a new keyword for the class, which is Overheal. Some of these cards will even be changed so they can work with Overheal, which is pretty neat. The cards that we are going to be losing is Merzard, Leah, Coltiran Chaplain, Focus Will, Power Infusion, Radiant Elemental, and Northshire Cleric. Then instead we are going to get Katarina, Dark Bishop Benedictus. Hey, he returns, so Shadow Priest will stick around, it looks like. Mana Geode, Crimson Clergy, Holy Champion, Shadow Ascendant, and Shard of the Naru. Blizzard stated they had 2 goals when they came up with this new core set: to introduce the new keyword, which is going to be Overheal, and to add Undead as a key identity of Priest as a class, which is a little bit weird to think about, given the fact that Priest is stereotypically really holy based. However, if we are going to support Shadow Priest, then those 2 identities are kind of merged into one. I'm really curious if they're just going to permanently keep Archbishop Benedictus in rotation, because he does support Shadow Priest, and it is a deck that they really do want to support. And he basically has just replaced Shadow Form in the core set to try to push that deck being a thing. Sure, it's not going to get support every individual year, but it is nice to have a little bit more variety of what priest decks that you can actually try to make use of. And honestly, this is probably the hardest part of making a priest core set, is the fact that there are 2 separate identities of the priest class. You have both the holy / disc healing priest, and then you also have Shadow Priest, which have a very much differing ideals. The closest that we've seen in another class to having something like this is Death Knight, where you have 3 instead of 2. And it makes me curious, maybe in the future they'll just make it where you can choose when making a priest deck to either have the Shadow Priest hero power. Either way, I do think Katarina probably is a card that will be absolutely broken in Undead Priest. Benedictus will make Shadow Priest keep being a thing, even though a lot of those cards are rotating out. It didn't really use a lot of the cards from Stormwind, a really good card to include in a Shadow Undead Priest, which is also going to be Shadow Ascendant. The 2 biggest hits that I'm really disappointed to see rotate out are both of the legendaries, as neither of them really got too much support before they did rotate out. Merzad was the closest to getting some playable support, as we did get a lot of dragons early in last year's rotation, but he really never did anything outside of Questline Priest or even Thief Priest. Now for Rogue, which is going to be the most controversial out of the entire bunch. Vanessa is rotating out. Sprint, Assassin's Blade, Sinister Strike, Tome Pillager, Plague Scientist, and Cold Blood are all gone. Instead, we are going to be getting Secret Support. Shadow Jeweler is going to be back. Elven Mistral, Ambush, Plagiarize, Cheat Death, Fan of Knives, and Eviscerate are all back instead. I don't know what they were thinking here. Secret Support for Rogue is great. It's a deck that I really do love. However, Secret Support with Rogue as it currently stands is not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is we're keeping both Shadow Step and Preparation. Those cards both have made a lot of other cards get nerfed over the past year and a half, and it's a very similar lesson that we learned from Bran, where we should have rotated everything back out quicker. Blizzard did state in this new rotation they are going to be making changes throughout the year, and so we don't end up with a similar situation to Bran. But honestly, Shadow Step being a thing still in rotation, and all the other cards that will bounce your cards back to your own hand, will make Rogue really, really powerful, even if you're not looking at this new Secret Support. I really do like the Secret Support, as mentioned before, because this could be a really cool deck where you could have a control style Rogue deck for once, using the Secret Support and the Concoction Support, 2 engines that work incredibly well with each other. We also might be losing a lot of the Thief Support, which would be the other engine you might want to fit in that type of deck. However, I do think this is going to be a pretty cool and fun deck to try out. The main thing that I'm worried about that is rotating out that I would have loved to stick around is good old Plague Scientist. This plus Pufferfister was always a fun little AoE that could remove everything from your opponent's board and then allow you to actually have a undead pirate deck. However, because Plague Scientist is gone, I don't know how powerful that deck is going to be after rotation. Fan of Knives is probably meant to be the replacement for Plague Scientist, and it is 1 mana cheaper, and you can buff it up with spell damage, which Rogue has done historically in the past. So who knows, that might still be a really powerful card there too. Overall, I'm really scared of what Rogue might be able to do in this new rotation, because it does feel like the class that won the most, because most of the cards that are getting removed never really saw any play outside of Vanessa and Sprint and maybe Sinister Strike. So let's look at some less worrisome cards. Shaman. Cragwise rotating out. Rest in peace, my big froggy. Mana Tide is also going to be rotating out. Maelstrom, Tidal Surge, and Rockbiter Weapon. So bye-bye any Alkir criminal lineup OTK combos you might have wanted to try out with the new rotation. But instead we are going to be getting Grand Totem Eyesore, Overdraft. Hey, Overload Shaman actually has a way to unlock their mana crystals. Thing from Beyond, Ancestral Knowledge, and Zap are all rotating back in. So we're seeing a little bit of Totem Shaman support in this next set. I do think Eyesore is a perfect card to actually have, and it does solve a lot of the issues I had with the Totem Shaman support back in Castle Nathria. We got that support once Eyesore actually had rotated out, but now we can use all of them in the same deck once again. This in combination with some of the other support from Castle Nathria might be a little bit problematic in the long run, but it could be cool for an early deck to test out. Overdraft is something that was much needed, and it does have tradable, which is why they probably included it over the other card that unlocks the mana crystals. Actually, I think there were two of them, but I can't remember their names. Thing from Beyond is really good if Totem Shaman is a thing. Ancestral Knowledge is a good draw power card to replace the Mana Tide Totem. And then finally, Zap. I don't know how playable it's going to be. Most minions that you want to remove now have 3 HP, and 2 damage is not enough, even if it does cost 0 mana, and it will still overload you the next turn. Overall, I do think Shaman probably got a lot more out of this rotation than they've lost, which is always a good sign. And I don't think any of these cards in theory are going to be too problematic where people are going to be complaining about these week 1, unlike the Rogue cards. Grand Totem is the closest thing you probably could get to one of those, but I think that he's perfectly fine for now. So let's go to the Warlock cards next. We're going to be saying bye-bye to all the discard Warlock support, even though we just got a bunch of new discard Warlock support in the last set. Haha. High Priestess, Felsoul Jailer, Void Terror, Tiny Knight of Evil, and Darkshire Librarian are all rotating out. Instead, we are going to be getting Mal'Ganis, Enhanced Dreadlord, Defile, Void Caller, and Spirit Ball. So Mal'Ganis plus the Jailer is immunity to everything, as long as you can get Mal'Ganis to actually survive. Though we do have Death Knight now, which might make that a little bit harder to pull off, it is still going to be one of those things that's going to be great to see in anyone's short that they actually end up making with the combo. Might not be the most positive win rate deck, but if you can make yourself immune to everything, then your opponent can do nothing against you. The other cards coming back in rotation should also help with a control style Warlock deck coming back, such as Defile, as that card can easily be abused in most Warlock control style decks, and is probably one of the best cards ever printed. Void Caller is also really good for some mana cheat if you have some very key demons that you want to place down on the board. And then Enhanced Dreadlord, I think, costs a little bit too much to see a lot of play, but you never know depending on how Void Caller ends up being. Spirit Bomb is just a really good turn 1 removal. Sure, you're doing 4 damage to your own face with a card like this, and we are going to be losing the quest line, so you can no longer get any advantage out of that. But I do think a card like this is probably pretty healthy for the game, so you can actually deal with some of the other things that your opponent might place down, since most turn 1 minions now have 3 HP instead of the normal 2 that they had back in the day. Now for probably the most disappointing class out of them all. Good old Warrior. We are going to be losing Darius Crowley, who never saw play, Gorehowl, Shield Maiden, Armor Smith, Blood Hoof Brave, Fiery War Axe, and Blood Cell Deckhand. We are going to be getting Armadillo, Blade Storm, Dynamic Sword Eater, Heavy Plate, Frighting Flunky, and then Woodcutter's Axe. I don't know what Blizzard was thinking with this new rotation. They said they had some really cool things in mind for Warrior's Core Set, but I don't see any redeeming factors here. Sword Eater is the closest thing. He's still really playable. He just rotated out 2 years ago. Bladestorm can also be played pretty decently, but outside of those two cards, I don't think any of these other ones, maybe Heavy Plate could be still played, though we no longer have Shield Slider to actually have an AoE board clear using a bunch of armor. Again, I don't, this does not save Warrior as a class. Sure, a lot of cards that were rotated out didn't see any play during the entire year they were in, but their replacements aren't going to either. The only hope for this is the fact that Blizzard did say they will be willing to change out cards if something becomes problematic. But if something isn't problematic, are they going to be willing to change out a card just to try to buff up a deck, or are they going to try to print new support cards that will be very powerful? Because if they go for new support cards, the class is still going to be weak once those cards rotate out, which is what's happening to Warrior right now. Warrior is losing so much good shit from Alterac Valley that I don't know where it's going to end up standing once the new rotation happens. The only viable Warrior deck I can think of that stays after this new rotation is Enraged Warrior, but everything else that Warrior has been known for the past year or two is gone. You're going to be losing Pirate Warrior, you're going to be losing a lot of control tools, you're going to be losing some other stuff that I can't think of right now because Warrior's just been not that good. I'm really worried about this class. It's always so hard to try to think of a Warrior deck, and then once you do, you end up finding out there's no way to actually win. This is just a really sad state to be in if you are a Warrior fan, and I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what cards you could put in this core set unless you just scrap the entire core set. And then you also have to scrap a lot of the mechanics that have been given to Warrior over the past few sets because they haven't done anything. I just wish there was something for Warrior fans. It's so night and day difference between Warrior and Rogue here that it isn't even funny. I get it. These cards are actually weirdly better than the cards rotating back in, but again, I don't know. So let's go to some more fun news, or depressing news, I guess, depending on how you view it. The neutral cards and Sir Finley for the legendaries. Instead, we are going to be getting a Ragnaros, Dr. Boom, Zilliax, and the Black Knight. Hey, 3 of these cards are incredibly classic cards from Hearthstone's history. Dr. 7 is back, a Ragnaros, which is essentially Dr. 8, or was, and good old Zilliax, who was in like 80% of the decks when he was in rotation. However, I think Zilliax is probably too slow of a card nowadays to see much play. I'm really sad that we are going to be losing Reno because there was no real good Reno deck that popped out throughout the entire time he was back in rotation. Bran is a card that should have been gone months ago. I don't know why they didn't rotate him out early. Elise was a fun card to mess around with, but again, not that good, and Sir Finley never really did anything either. But generally speaking, while we are going to be losing a lot of build-around cards, we are gaining 4 really strong generic minions that could be easy replacements in some decks. Dr. Boom might be a little bit too slow nowadays, but he is still an iconic card. Now for the epics that are going to be rotating out. Mossy Horror, Faceless Manipulator, Goodbye Sweet Prince, Escaped a Mana Saber. Instead, we are going to be gaining Dirty Rat as the only new epic. But man, is he epic against any type of combo deck. This could also really backfire depending on what you're actually playing. This card isn't going to be an auto-include in every deck, but depending on how the meta actually shapes up, this could easily destroy any combo that your opponent might have in their hand or in the deck, depending on what you can drag out with a card like this. And we are going to be gaining Replicating Menace, Eater of Secrets, Cult Neophyte, and Armor Vendor. So, hey, more support for hate on spell-based decks, which is always cool. This is going to be a really nice core set as it's shaping up, at least on the neutral front, as it should allow for other decks to actually form and maybe even have a nice wide variety of different answers you possibly could use. You can also use a lot of these cards that we will be seeing rotating back in a ETC pool, as not all of these cards will be useful in every single matchup. I could easily see someone running ETC to get both a Dirty Rat or a Cult Neophyte in their pool, plus one other card that might be just generically good for their deck, depending on what type of deck they're actually running. Armor Vendor is always nice because it gains a little bit of survivability for classes that may or may not need it. Replicating a Menace is good for the mech decks that have been floating around, and we are going to continue to see some support for. And then finally, Eater of Secrets. I don't really think this card will ever do anything because secret decks aren't really always the most competitive, but again is another really nice ETC pool target. And honestly speaking, for the rares that are rotating out, the only one that really hurts is Acidic Ooze, but we will be seeing a much better replacement later on. For the commons that we're going to be rotating out are going to start with Storm Watcher, Cobalt Scalebane, Dark Iron Dwarf, Jungle Panther, Ironbeak Owl, Sun Reaver Spy, Mistress of Mixtures, and Murloc Tiny Fin. Instead, we are going to be getting cards like War Gear, Rotten Applebottom, Royal Librarian, Dread Corsair, Hench Clan Thug, Bronze Gatekeeper, Rusted Viper, Glacial Shard, Mermy, Tour Guide, and finally, Snow Flipper Penguin. Hey, so basically all the cards that were generic removal tools that were in the standard rotation before are going to be replaced with their Storm 1 counterparts with tradable, which should in theory make a lot of these cards a lot more playable than their original counterparts. However, we do also have ETC in rotation, so I don't know how much more playable they are going to be outside of being targets for ETC. I'm also kind of curious if we are going to see a lot of mechs in this current set or in a future set, because there is too much magnetic support for me not to consider them maybe trying to do something with it. There's a lot of generically good common cards right here. We're not actually losing too much out of the commons that are going to be rotating out. The closest is going to be Mistress of Mixtures and Murloc Tiny Fin for those Murloc decks. But outside of that, I think all the other cards that are going to be coming back in rotation are just way better replacements for cards that aren't. I think legendary-wise, the only card that I would have kept would have been Reno Jackson over the Black Knight, because Black Knight probably will never ever see any competitive play, but Reno Jackson always has a potential to see play depending on what the cards are in rotation or not, and he is just a nice, really build-around card, though I am going to miss him in rotation as mentioned before. So those were all the cards revealed for the new core set of Year of the Wolf. Let me know down below what classes you think won the most, because there is definitely a clear winner, and what class you think lost. There's definitely a clear loser in this batch. And like always, if you enjoyed the video, please do like, comment, subscribe. Until next time, bye.